continue to pray for them. The political situation there in Brazil is tenuous. There is a provision in the Constitution that allows the military to step in the case of fraudulent elections, but who determines whether or not that's fraudulent and that kind of thing is a bit ambiguous to me. And really then the allegiance of the military becomes significant at that point. But there's fears of potentially the guy that was announced with the most votes for the election has communist ties, and a lot of the bordering countries to Brazil are communist as well. So there's fear of interference from other countries and that kind of thing. So I'm not 100% sure what's going on with American politics, much less Brazil. But we do need to pray for their safety and also pray for their religious liberty. That's the reason I'm sharing these things. And it's a little bit like American news in this sense. No matter what source you believe, the bottom line is there's unrest and chaos, and there's threats to religious liberty and such. So do pray for that. Dr. Love is not here this morning, but recently he was telling some very interesting stories. His dad was a missionary in Brazil, and I guess this was in the 60s, maybe the 1960s, when there was there was more political unrest similar to this. I guess for the last 50 years or so in Brazil, there's been more calm or whatever, but they were there during that time when there was a coup and an uprising and civil war and that kind of thing. So, just trying to put some names and faces of people I know now on some of those stories from 50 years ago reminds us of the urgency of the situation. I do continue to pray for Gabe and Susan. I don't know if any of you saw their prayer letter that came out this week, but they're established with a well-recommended doctor now. They've gotten some, initial answers, and then they have some more appointments lined up for January. So do continue to pray for good answers for them on Susan's health and for their safety as they travel. Something like 10,000 miles to meetings already this year. That's a lot of miles and crazy drivers. So continue to pray for them. Continue to pray for the Lockharts and his ministry there at Worldwide. And as his meetings continue to increase, he'll be one of those putting on a lot of miles on the road. So pray for the Lord's safety and protection there. And then the Maietas in Italy, the way they have their services arranged. I think typically by the time we have our Sunday school hour now, they're about done for the day. But continue to pray for the work there in Grosseto. And I hope you were able to see Pastor's report on Sunday night. If not, hopefully the video worked. You can go back and watch it on YouTube or wherever that is. But continue to pray for them. Pray about their building space and for laborers and such, and for God's blessing there. Karis and Dwight Smith's family, they've been there for the last 2 or 3 weeks. They're traveling back this week, so pray for their safety and adjustment and all that as they come back. All right, so let's go to the Lord in prayer this morning and remember these requests. And Brother Jeremy, why don't you word a prayer for us this morning, please? Amen. Thank you. All right. We are in 2 Kings chapter 7, if you want to try to find that with me. 2 Kings chapter 7. We are looking at the miracles of Elisha. Our study is on the kings of Israel and Judah, but right here in the beginning of the book of 2 Kings, basically there's a pause. It kind of shifts from the timeline of the kings to pretty much all the miracles of Elisha recorded in one lump here. So we left off with 2 Kings chapter 6 last week, where the king of Syria got frustrated about losing battles and sent his army down to capture Elisha, only for Elisha to pray down a blindness, a supernatural blindness, lead them back to Samaria, and then send them home. Well, then, probably 2 or 3 years later, but a little while later, he sends his army back to siege Samaria. We talked last week about the food prices and the desperation of the people, that they were selling, donkey's head and dove's dung at extremely high prices because they had nothing else to eat. The two women, agreed to boil their children. It was just a terrible situation. Okay. Then we pick up in chapter 7, verse 1. Then Elisha said, "Hear you the word of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord, tomorrow about this time shall a measure of fine flour be sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel, in the gate of Samaria." Now remember, Samaria is the city that's been under siege. They're so depleted that they have nothing. They're the ones that have been selling donkey's head for 2-3 months' salary. And the prophecy here is that food will be at greatly discounted prices. Verse 2, then the Lord on whose hand the king leaned answered the man of God and said, "Behold, if the Lord would make windows in heaven, might this thing be?" And that phrase, windows in heaven, is used typically in the scriptures of miraculous provision. He said, even if God did a miracle, that wouldn't happen, is basically what he's saying. Verse 3, there were 4 leprous men at the entering into the gate, and they said one to another, "Why sit we here until we die? If we say we will enter into the city, the famine's in the city, we'll die there. If we sit here, we die. Now therefore come and let us fall into the host of the Syrians. If they save us alive, we shall live, and if they kill us, we shall but die." My paraphrase, we're going to die anyway. Verse 5, they rose up in the twilight to go into the camp of the Syrians, and when they were come to the uttermost part of the camp of Syria, behold, there was no man there. For the Lord had made the host of the Syrians to hear a noise of chariots and a noise of horses, even the noise of a great host. And they said one to another, "Lo, the king of Israel hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians to come upon us." Wherefore they arose and fled in the twilight, and left their tents and their horses, their asses, their camp as it was, and fled for their life. And when these lepers came to the uttermost part of the camp, they went into one tent and did eat and drink, and carried thence silver and gold and raiment, and went and hid it, and came again and entered into another tent, and carried thence also, and went and hid it. Now, is anything about that behavior unusual? I mean, they said, we're going to die if we sit here and starve to death. We go in the city, we're going to starve to death and die. So if we go over to Syria and they kill us, we're going to die anyway, but maybe they'll be nice to us. Maybe they'll throw us some scraps. Well, when they got there, they found it was deserted. So what did they do? They had something to eat. It's exactly what you would do, right? How many of you, you tried to be good and not eat much on Thursday morning so you could eat a big meal, on Thursday lunch, right? Okay, that was, I tried. I did fairly well to hold off until the big dinner. But, that was a few hours? And, we didn't eat till like 1 or 1:30, which is after the time I normally eat. So, I'm starting to, get lightheaded and shakes. No, I'm exaggerating. But, we feel that way sometimes. I'm 2 or 3 hours past my normal meal time. I'm going to die. It's probably been weeks since these guys had anything substantive to eat. Okay, so when they show up and nobody's around and there's food, what do? They sat down and ate. The same thing you did when you were finally told, all right, let's gather around the table. It's time to eat. They filled up a plate and they had at it. They had seconds. They filled themselves up. There's nothing unusual really about that. It's human nature. And then what they did is they took the gold, silver, and the raiment, the valuables, and went and hid it. Now, are you picturing this in your mind? what are these lepers going to do with this? I mean, in Israel, what happened with the lepers? Why were they outside the city to start with? Because they weren't allowed to intermingle with the population. Okay, they were medically unclean, religiously unclean. It was a contagious condition that was considered incurable. So they were outside the city. Everybody else was inside the city walls for protection. Where are the lepers? They're left outside. If they die, oh well, they're going to die anyway. So, they're left to fend for themselves. But what I'm saying is they go hide this gold and silver. What good's it going to do them? They can't say, woohoo, now we can pay the doctors and we can get a cure. There was no cure for leprosy. But it's human nature, right? I got some. I'm going to try to hang on to it. Maybe it's like, okay, I can't work a job because of my leprosy. Maybe I can put this up and give it to my wife and kids or, whatever. But they went and hid it, and then they come back and do that again. Verse 9, then it kind of hits them. What's going on here? Then they said one to another, we do not well. This day is a day of good tidings, and we hold our peace. If we tarry till the morning light, some mischief will come upon us. Now therefore come, that we may go and tell the king's household. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Who was it that's left them outside the city to die? Those same people. But they realized, hey, we have an obligation to these people to share the good news with them. They said, if something happens to us tonight and we never get to deliver the message tomorrow, we're going to be in trouble. And they're going to be in trouble. Now, even though they were lepers and they were ostracized, they still had a concern for, this would have been their neighbors, probably their family, their friends. They had a concern for them. They didn't want to see them die of starvation, but they all realized that was a very real possibility at this point. But, it just hit them. Wait a minute, what are we doing? You ever had those moments? What am I doing? Here, it was a realization of, it's not just about us. There's enough here for everybody. And we ought to share this. Now, this was an actual story. Is there an application here? I mean, this ought to be a pretty easy application, I would think, they said it's a day of good tidings. What does the word gospel mean? Good tidings or good news, okay? To preach the gospel comes from a word that means, to preach the good news or to share the good news. I mean, could we make an application for us today? I think, yeah, that'd be pretty easy. This is a day of good tidings, and we hold our peace. If we tarry till the morning light, some mischief will come upon us. In other words, if we procrastinate, we might lose the opportunity to share this. We better share it now while we have a chance. This time is the tract distribution emphasis for our church as a reminder of the urgency of sharing the gospel. Is the gospel good news? Yeah. Is it better news than Thanksgiving dinner to starving people? Yeah. And yet, we still sometimes, have the tendency to get tied up with our duties, right? Or our situations, our needs. None of that's bad. I mean, we have responsibilities to take care of our, jobs, take care of our family, all those things. But sometimes we get tied up and we need to just stop and realize, wait a minute, we do not well. We need to share this good news while we have an opportunity. I mean, how long do we have to share the good news? When is Jesus returning? Let me hit Google real quick. Some nut has made a prediction. And I guess the theory is if you make enough predictions, one of them hits, right? But, we don't know. We have never known, and every generation since the time of the apostles has been under the impression that, it could be at any point in time. I mean, we can look at prophecies that have been fulfilled and things that have kind of come together and say, it seems like there's far more pieces that have come together in our day and not really much that needs to happen before the Lord could return and other events could fall into place with world events, world politics, that kind of thing. In other words, how long do we have? We don't know. So that means we should procrastinate or we should have a sense of urgency. We know the answer to that. We should have a sense of urgency in sharing the good news. The lepers here were focused on themselves, and they're like, wait a minute, no. We need to share this with everybody. And isn't it easy to do that with salvation and the worship of the Lord? And, we try to focus on having a personal walk with God and having a prayer time and, the things that we ought to do. And sometimes it's easy just to kind of get more tunnel vision on that. And wait a minute, no. I need to, lift up my eyes and see the fields. Need to see the harvest. Here the lepers said, we do not well. This day is the day of good tidings, and we hold our peace. Verse 10, so they came and called unto the porter of the city, and they told him, we came to the camp of the Syrians, and behold, there's no man there. Neither the voice of man, but horses tied and asses, and the tents as they were. All right, now, what would you be thinking if you got this report? How long have they been under siege in Samaria? I mean, if they're down to the point where they're selling, donkeys' heads, and they have nothing of any food value left to share, it's been months, right? Possibly a couple of years. It's been a very long time. They realized that, they're had. They have no outlet. They have no help. God had miraculously caused the army of Syria to hear things. You ever done that? Been home by yourself and hear things? You're just sure that you heard something and you go check it out and all of that. I mean, sometimes it's just annoying, and sometimes, it really can stimulate your adrenaline, right? You're just sure you heard somebody in the house or whatever. God stimulated them in such a way that they thought they heard an oncoming army. They were just sure that mercenaries had been hired against them, and they were outnumbered, and they just ran for it. But if they went to the gate and they called for the porter, they called for the attendant, and they relayed the message. Now, if you hear, hey, the Syrians have left, they left everything, their camp's empty. There's part of you that wants to believe that. And then there's part of you that's like, it's too good to be true. Right? That's too good to be true. This has got to be a trick. This has got to be a scam. Well, they went and told the king. Verse 12, the king arose in the night. So it sounds like, by the time it was getting dark, by the time they decided, hey, we need to go back and share the message. And so, it's nighttime. They get back and they decide, well, do we wake up the king or don't we? Yeah, we better wake up the king just in case. The king arose, verse 12, in the night and said to his servants, I'll show you what the Syrians have done to us. They know we're hungry. Therefore, they've gone out of the camp to hide themselves in the field, saying, when they come out of the city, we'll catch them alive and get into the city. I mean, I understand that. Militarily, I understand it. Just from the standpoint of paranoia at that point, I understand it. But at the same time, why wouldn't you take a chance on that, right? Verse 13, one of the servants said, let some take, I pray thee, 5 of the horses that remain which are left in the city. Behold, there is all the multitude of Israel that are left in it. Behold, they're saying even as all the multitude of the Israels that are consumed. In other words, what he's saying is, if we lose 5 horses, they're all about to die just like the people are. That's what he's saying. And let us send and see. So did the king give them 5? No, but he did give them 2. Verse 14, they took therefore 2 chariot horses, and the king sent after the host of the Syrians, saying, go and see. And they went after them unto Jordan, and lo, all the way was full of garments and vessels, which the Syrians had cast away in their haste, and the messengers returned and told the king. The people went out and spoiled the tents of the Syrians. So in their fear, in their panic, they were lightening the boat all the way down, the trail to the river. They're running away, they're hearing noises, and they're running in a panic. So the people went out and spoiled the tents of the Syrians. What does that spoiled mean? Does that mean it's like the milk that's 3 weeks past date and you take the cap off the jug? No, spoil means to take captive or to capture or to claim as your own. Okay? To be spoiled means that you were captured or you were claimed as someone else's prize. Okay, so they spoiled the tents of the Syrians. A measure of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel, according to the word of the Lord. Okay? I don't have it on here. But this goes right back to the prophecy of Elisha, in verse 1. Remember, I told you last week that a cab of dove's dung, which is somewhere between, the size of a Rubik's Cube, depending on one Bible dictionary, encyclopedia that I read, maybe a quart, dry measure, 4 cups, something like that. That was sold for 5 shekels. Okay? Here, it says a measure of fine flour was sold for a shekel. Right? A measure, again, if you read 3 or 4 or 5 Bible encyclopedias, you're going to get slightly different. But I took International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, which is a standard reference. But using that, a measure is equivalent to about 1.5 pecks, our measures, or 10 quarts, dry measure, 10 cups. Okay? So as opposed, you get 2 to 4 cups of dove's dung for 5 shekels, or you get, what's 10 times 4? 40 cups of fine flour for 1 shekel. All right? The price has gone way down and the quality's gone way up. This is exactly what that one servant of the king had said was impossible. Fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley, which would have been, not the higher quality, but, there's more of it. So in other words, that would be the ramen noodles of the day, I guess. Verse 17, the king appointed the Lord on whose hand he leaned to have the charge of the gate. And the people trode on him in the gate, and he died, as the man of God had said, who spake when the king came down to him. And it came to pass, as the man of God had spoken to the king, saying, 2 measures of barley for a shekel, and a measure of fine flour for a shekel, so shall be tomorrow about this time in the gate of Samaria. And that Lord answered the man of God, now behold, if the Lord should make windows in heaven, might such a thing be? And he said, behold, thou shalt see it with thine eyes, but thou shalt not eat thereof. So it fell out unto him, for the people trode upon him in the gate, and he died. The very man that said, that's impossible. If God can't do that big a miracle, is what he meant when he said, if God opens the windows of heaven, could this thing be? In other words, even a miracle of God wouldn't bring about what you're talking about, Elisha. And Elisha says, all right, fine, you're going to see it, but you're not going to participate in it. Now, it says the people trode on him in the gate, and he died. You think that was an angry mob? You think they hated this guy? I don't think so. I think they were starving. They were literally starving to death. And when they heard there was food and the story was verified, this guy was supposed to be in the gate. He was supposed to, all right, now let's have order. It's like the poor slacker whose job it is to, unlock the doors on Black Friday morning at 5 a.m. at the store, right? You ever seen videos of that? In certain instances, I've seen videos of that where, there's a whole line standing at the door and the poor employee is just trying to get out alive. Walmart, they used to, I don't know, I did not venture out to Walmart on Black Friday, but they used to put pallets, in the aisleways, and the workers would be bringing out pallets and people would be tearing at the plastic wrap before they even stopped and took it off the pallet jack. And we're like, wow, that's bad manners. This is far worse. This was manslaughter. They trampled the man to death. They were so hungry that they ran him over. Get out of the way. Stampeded him to death. That was the judgment of God. God had, through his spokesman Elisha, had said, all right, fine. If you're not willing to believe me, I'm going to show you to prove that I can do it. But I'm not going to let you participate in the blessing. Now, that was an actual story. We're talking about Samaria. The king is still an idolater. These are not people that are believers in God, okay? Samaria was the capital of the northern kingdom. They all worshipped the golden calves of Jeroboam or the Baal in some form or fashion. They were all idolaters. But I do think there's an application for you and me here as well. I mean, here, the man that refused to believe God was told, all right, fine, you're going to see what God can do, but you're not going to participate in any of the blessing. I'd hate to be in that position, wouldn't you? I would not want to be told, all right, fine, I'm going to show you just to see, but you don't get to personally enjoy any of the blessing. That'd be awful. I mean, the man died starving hungry, right? Trampled to death is an awful way to go. But as he's dying, he also realizes, I was completely wrong. Remember, this is an idolatrous man that said, your God, Elisha, can't do this. And God says, all right, just fine. Step back and watch, see what I can do. Now, this is a rhetorical question, but still, I think it ought to make us think. Do you want to enjoy the blessings of God? Or do you want to miss out on the blessings of God? I mean, we think about Christmas time coming. You know, we're in the age bracket now where we're more, kind of handing out gifts to the kids and stuff like that. But, you still hope there's at least one with your name on it, right? Do you want the blessings of God to be handed out and there's no package with your name on it? And you're like, okay, very funny. Everybody's open there. Okay, joke's on me. All right, it's fine. Where's the present? No, there isn't one. I mean, it would be, the New Testament equivalent to that would be probably, 1 Corinthians 3, gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, and stubble, and having everything consumed, having nothing of lasting value. But here, the blessings of God were present, and he completely missed out on it. I don't want to be there, and I know you don't. Why did he miss out on the blessings of God? Because he refused to believe God. He mocked the Word of God. But simply, if I could just boil it down more simply, he refused to believe the promise of God through God's spokesman. Is that not what the New Testament says when it says you have not because ye... Sometimes we miss out, and it's our own fault. But you see here, the prophecy of Elisha was fulfilled and the judgment on the Lord. All right, now that brings us to chapter 8. And we're told here, Elisha prophesied a famine, but really, it seems like this story is primarily about the Shunammite woman. Verse 1, Then spake Elisha unto the woman whose son he had restored to life, saying, Arise, go thou and thine household, and sojourn wherever thou canst sojourn, for the Lord hath called for a famine, and it shall come upon the land 7 years. And the woman arose and did after the saying of the man of God, and she went with her household and sojourned in the land of the Philistines 7 years. It came to pass at 7 years' end that the woman returned out of the land of the Philistines, and she went forth to cry unto her king for her house and for her land. So what had happened while she was gone? They had sold it, or somebody else had claimed it. The kinsman redeemer had claimed it, or it had been sold at auction. It had been claimed for unpaid taxes and sold. That would be the modern day equivalent of that, right? But she lost her property. 7 years. Now, the timing of this is very puzzling to me, I'm going to be honest, because of verse 4. The king talked with Gehazi, the servant of the man of God. Anybody else remember what happened to Gehazi a couple chapters ago? Doc, go ahead. What happened? Yeah. He lied to Naaman and took money that God did not want taken. And so Elisha said, the leprosy of Naaman's on you. So why is the king talking to Gehazi at this point? I mean, are they talking at a great distance with, double masking? Or did this story chronologically come first? I don't really know. Can't really sort that out. But the king is talking with Gehazi. And so at this point, apparently Gehazi was able to interact. I don't know. Maybe Gehazi repented, but it seems to me like chapter 5 says, the last verse of chapter 5 says, the leprosy of Naaman shall cleave unto thee and to thy seed forever. So it seems like that was a permanent judgment on Gehazi, so maybe this story chronologically comes first. But we're given the story here in chapter 8. But the king talked with Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, saying, Tell me, I pray thee, all the great things that Elisha hath done. Human nature is human nature. People like to hear stories about great accomplishments or, fantastic things. Hey, tell me some stories about what the things that Elisha has done. Verse 5, it came to pass as he was telling the king how he had restored a dead body to life. That would go back to chapter 4 when the Shunammite woman had placed her son in the prophet's chamber upstairs and gone to find Elisha and refused to accept the servant. No, Elisha, you're coming with me. It was that story. That behold, the woman whose son he had restored to life, middle of verse 5, cried to the king for her house and for her land. And Gehazi said, My lord, O king, this is the woman, and this is her son, whom Elisha restored to life. And when the king asked the woman, she told him. Is that true? Yeah, she told him the story. So the king appointed unto her a certain officer, saying, restore all that was hers, and all the fruits of the field, since the day that she left the land, even until now. Well, that's a bonus. She got all the benefits of the farm without having worked the farm for the last 7 years. All of the harvest or all of the sales from the produce and such. But it seems like this story about the famine is primarily included to talk about God's continued blessing on the Shunammite woman. Now, the Shunammite woman is the one that had gone to her husband and said, hey, there's a man of God passing by here. Can we build him a little chamber? And her care for the prophet Elisha seems to have continued to result in God's blessing on her as a result of that. All right? So you have here the story of the Shunammite woman. And then in the rest of chapter 8, you have the prophecy of the death of the king of Syria. Verse 7, Elisha came to Damascus. Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, was sick, and it was told him, saying, the man of God has come hither. Now, what else have we seen previously about Ben-Hadad and Elisha? This is the same guy that sent his army to encircle the city to capture him. He was so mad that Elisha kept spoiling his military plans and telling the king of Israel what was happening. He sent his army down there to capture Elisha. Elisha took this man's army, walked them into the capital of Samaria, and then said, Lord, open their eyes. They saw where they were, and then sent them home. It's the same guy. Okay? This is not a believer in the God of heaven by any stretch. But he respected the power of God that was evident in the life of Elisha. Verse 8, the king said to Hazael, take a present in thine hand, and go and meet the man of God, and inquire of the Lord by him, saying, shall I recover of this disease? Now, when you read that, don't read any further just yet. When you read that, take a present in thine hand, what do you think of? I mean, we think of a present, we typically think of some sort of a box or something wrapped up with something in it. But when Saul said, let's take a present to the seer and maybe he can help us, what was the present? It was some wild honey and some figs, and that kind of thing. So it was usually relatively small. When David was getting ready to kill Nabal, Abigail showed up with a little bit larger present because she had to feed 600 men of David. She had several animals that she loaded down with food. But when we think take a present, we would think something like that, something probably that you can carry or maybe put on one animal. That it was sometimes gold or silver, sometimes it was food gifts. Look at the present that Hazael took, verse 9. So Hazael went to meet him and took a present with him of every good thing of Damascus. What's the next phrase? 40 camels burden. I mean, the camels were already the vehicles of the wealthy, if you will. They were the SUVs, not the Honda Fit or the Prius, But how much did Abraham's servant take when he went to find a bride for Isaac? I believe that was 10 camels. Okay? 40 camels burden is a whole lot. Okay? I've been around camels in a zoo setting. Okay? I've not been to Israel or seen the settings there, but I mean, it's a big animal. If they want to strap it down, they could carry, quite the load if they were going to bundle things up. 40 camels burden? I mean, if I'm going to put it in modern day terminology, this is multiple 15-passenger vans with the seats out filled up. Okay? This was not a, here's a coffee mug, thanks for visiting kind of a gift. Okay? This was an enormous present. This shows tremendous respect. This is the kind of gift a king could give, but this also shows how desperate the king was to find out, am I going to die or am I going to live? Okay? So he took 40 camels' burden and came and stood before him and said, thy son, Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, hath sent me to thee. That's a different tone of voice, isn't it? Thy son, Ben-Hadad? This is the same Ben-Hadad that ordered the army to go kill him. This is humble. This is respectful. This is a totally different tone. Thy son Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, has sent me to thee, saying, shall I recover of this disease? Verse 10, Elisha said unto him, go, say unto him, thou mayest certainly recover. Howbeit the Lord has showed me that he shall surely die. And he settled his countenance steadfastly until he was ashamed. And the man of God wept. Can you picture that? What does that mean? He settled his countenance steadfastly. He's trying his best to bite his lip, rub his face, and he's trying to keep his composure. Finally, it says he wept. Verse 12, Hazael said, why weepeth my Lord? And he answered, because I know the evil that thou wilt do unto the children of Israel. Their strongholds wilt thou set on fire, and their young men wilt thou slay with a sword, and wilt dash their children and rip up their women with child. Hazael said, but what? Is thy servant a dog that he should do this great thing? He said, I would never do anything like that. Elisha answered, the Lord has showed me that thou shalt be king over Syria. So he departed from Elisha and came to his master, who said unto him, what said Elisha to thee? And he said, he told me that thou shouldest surely recover, which was true. Verse 15, it came to pass on the morrow that he took a thick cloth, dipped it in water, and spread it on his face, so that he died. And Hazael reigned in his stead. It's interesting. It is, but it's also not everything about having the Lord reveal things to Elisha was big and bombastic and exciting, right? Here, the word of the Lord, the revelation of the Lord came with a great burden. The king, earlier in chapter 8, the king in Samaria, would be the king of Israel, had said, hey, tell me the great stories, and we like those things. But here, there was great burdens that went with it as well. He said, you're going to be the next king of Syria. And, I know what you're going to eventually do to Israel. That was great weight. There was a great burden here. So he went and he smothered the king of Syria to death. I mean, assassination is as old as human population, right? All the way back to Cain and Abel. But here, this has nothing to do directly with Israel. This has to do with Syria, a neighboring country. Why would God allow his prophet to deal with them? They're not even Israelites. Why would God allow his prophet to deal with them? Because God is the God of the whole world. Because God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. Okay? Jew first, and also to the Greek. I mean, we tend to think, very tribally sometimes. Well, it's Israel, and God should deal with them, or it's America, and this is where God's working, or whatever. But God was willing to deal with Syria too, if they were willing to respond. The rest of the chapter, verse 16, the 5th year of Joram, son of Ahab, Jehoshaphat being then king of Judah, you have we're going back on the timeline now. Okay? The events in the rest of chapter 8 deal with things that we've already covered on the king's timeline. This is kind of backing up to 2 Kings chapter 1 and 2, and the events there on the timeline. Now the story kind of blends back in to where we left off with the kings. In chapters 1 and 2, you had Elijah calling down, fire from heaven, devouring the 50 and the 50, and you had the river Jordan parted, and Elijah caught up on a whirlwind, Elisha saying, where's the Lord God of Elijah? And then the focus kind of shifted off of that to all the miracles. But now we're kind of coming back to the history of it, and the rest of chapter 8 kind of leads into the timeline that we had previously been looking at. Okay? In chapter 9, verse 1, Elisha the prophet called one of the children of the prophets and said, gird up thy loins and take this box of oil and go to Ramoth Gilead. When thou comest hither, look out Jehu, the son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi, and go in and make him arise from among his brethren and carry him into an inner chamber. So chapter 9 shifts back to the anointing of Jehu, and it's going to shift back to the kings then. That is basically where we left off previously before we looked at the miracles. We left off with Ahaziah, and said when we left off with the study of Ahaziah, we said that Jehu was given the task to get rid of the house of Ahab, and he did that. Jehu, his dynasty would be one of the longest dynasties, his family, but of the northern kingdom. It wasn't too terribly long, but of the northern kingdom there were 4 main families, and Jehu's dynasty was the longest. So we're kind of shifting back on the timeline there, which wraps up this section on the miracles of Elijah and Elisha. Tremendous application, I think, in a lot of ways, but I think particularly in chapter 7 and 8, the application for you and me: why sit we here until we die? And you're going to see it, but you're not going to partake of it. I think tremendous challenge for you and me to trust God, to trust His Word, but also to share the good news that we have. Theirs was good news of survival. There was food. They didn't have to starve to death. Our good news is the gospel of eternal life. And in these stories, New Testament might call them parables, but these aren't actually parables, they're real-life stories. In these real-life stories, we see tremendous spiritual lessons for you and me. So this will kind of wrap up the miracles of Elisha, and then next week we will look at Jehu and jump back into the study of the line of the kings. All right, let's close in a word of prayer. Thank you, Lord, for the truth of Scripture. Lord, help us to be on the side that is willing to trust you, believe your word, and see you work. I pray, Lord, that you'd help us not to miss out because either we don't ask or we won't believe. And Lord, I pray that during this Christmas season, when folks are sometimes a little more receptive to talking about Jesus or talking about spiritual things, I pray that you'd give us the boldness that we need to share the gospel. I pray now for the preaching hour to come that your hand of blessing would